Now we will engage in questions under the 5-minute rule. I yield myself 5 minutes for the purpose of questioning the witnesses. Mr. Goldman, can you please explain the difference between Vice President Biden's request to Ukraine a few years ago and President Trump's request to Ukraine earlier this year?
Yes, when Vice President Biden pressured the Ukrainian president to remove the corrupt prosecutor general, he was doing so with an international consensus as part of U.S. policy. The entire European Union supported that. The IMF supported that. The IMF, which also gave the loans that he was referring to. And so he did that as part of the entire international community's consensus. And when President Trump is asking for this investigation of Joe Biden, all of the witnesses, every single one, testified that that had nothing to do with official U.S. policy.
And Vice President Biden's request had no personal political benefit, whereas President Trump's request did?
Yes, in fact, if the witnesses testified that if that corrupt prosecutor general were actually removed, it would be because he was not prosecuting corruption. So the witnesses said that by removing that prosecutor general and adding a new one, that there was an increased chance that corruption in Ukraine would be prosecuted, including as it related to the Burisma company, which his son was on the board of.
Thank you. Now, Mr. Goldman, can you please explain exactly what happened with the phone records obtained by the Intelligence Committee?
Yeah, thank you. I would like to set the record straight on that. This is a very basic and usual investigative practice where people involved in a scheme or suspected to be involved in a scheme, investigators routinely seek their records. And just to be very clear, this is metadata. It is only call to, call from, and length. It is not the content of the calls or the text messages. So there's no content, there's no risk of invading any communications with lawyers or journalists or attorney-client, that none of that exists, and there are no risks to that. And so what we did is for the people that, several of the people that we had investigated and subpoenaed and who were alleged to be part of the scheme, we got call records so that we could corroborate some of their testimony or figure out maybe there's additional communications that we were unaware of. What we then did is we took the call records and we match it up with important events that occurred during the scheme. And we start to see if there are patterns, because call records can be quite powerful circumstantial evidence. In this case, it just so happened that people who were involved in the President Trump scheme were communicating with the president's lawyer, who was also involved in the scheme, a journalist, a staff member of Congress, and another member of Congress. We, of course, did not at all seek in any way, shape, or form to do any investigation on anyone, a member of Congress or a staff member of Congress. It just happened to be that they were in communication with people involved in the president's scheme.
And everything you did was basically standard operating procedure for a well-run investigation?
Every investigation in 10 years that I did, probably we got call records for.
Thank you. Mr. Goldman, did White House counsel make his view clear about witnesses and evidence requested by the investigating committees, and what was that view?
We never heard from the White House counsel. Other than the letter, which basically just said, we will not at all cooperate with this investigation in any way, shape, or form. They never reached out to engage in this accommodation process. It was a complete stonewall. Not only will the White House not participate and not cooperate and not respond to the duly authorized subpoenas of Congress, but the White House says we are also going to direct every other executive branch agency to defy this.
Thank you. Now I have a series of questions, and please keep your answers brief if you can. During last week's hearing, my Republican colleague said that Congress has not built a sufficient record to impeach the president at this stage. As a former prosecutor, you have spent years building substantial case records. What is the strength of the record here?
I think we have moved fast, and I think that the evidence is really overwhelming. We have 17 witnesses with overlapping and consistent statements.
And the committee managed to collect such a compelling record in the face of unprecedented obstruction by the president, correct?
Yes.
And was the obstruction so pervasive that the evidence pointed to a course of conduct or a plan to cover up any presidential misconduct?
We did find that there was an effort to conceal the president's conduct, yes.
And I understand that on October 8th, the White House wrote a letter explaining that President Trump had directed his administration not to cooperate with the White House's impeachment inquiry. In the letter, the White House counsel wrote, quote, President Trump cannot permit his administration to participate in this partisan inquiry under the circumstances. Now, the investigative committees tried to interview dozens of witnesses, including current and former Trump administration officials, and was stymied with respect to most of them. Is that correct?
There were 12 witnesses who were directed not to appear, and ultimately they did not appear.
Thank you very much. My time has expired. I yield to the ranking member, Mr. Collins.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Mr. Goldman, it's an interesting thing now. So now we can commit basically extortion or put pressure on others as long as we have the international community behind us. As long as we get enough people to think we're okay, I can then go extort anybody I want to. As long as enough people think it's okay. That was in essence what you just said. Whether you believe it or not, that's what, as I copied the notes. But I want to go to the phone records.
We want to pause briefly to welcome our viewers from our CBS stations. I'm Tanya Rivero in New York, continuing our CBSN special report. We now take you back to the hearing.
Congress now for the last few years on the FISA program and other things, which, by the way, this committee should be hearing FISA this week. The IG report just came out, and we're doing this. It's interesting to see to me that the calls in the metadata and not the content. What the problem I have here is this, is if Rudy, Nunez, Giuliani, Nunez, and Harvey were the only phone records returned from the subpoena, why are these released? Here's the problem. You took the committee, and this is why I want to know who ordered it. The committee made a choice. Chairman Schiff, who I'm assuming because he's not here, or you, who did get to come, at least thank you for showing up, made a conscious choice to put these records into the report. It was a drive-by. It was a gratuitous drive-by that you wanted to smear the ranking member or smear these others because they were in those numbers that were connected to that. I'm not saying you knew the content, I'm not saying anything else. In fact, you just admitted just a second ago that it was simply they were contacting these people. The problem I have with that is you could have just as easily put, if you were really wanting to do a professional non-smear report, it said Congressperson 1 or Congressperson 2, Reporter 1, Reporter 2, because if they did not actually contribute to your report, it is nothing but a drive-by. That's the problem I have here. I have no problem with you working here. I have no problem with the report. I have no problem with the subpoena. And you can pretty it up all you want. That was nothing but showed the American people that at least for a moment, the Schiff report became a partisan smear against other members we don't like because there's other alternatives for you to do. I have no problem, as I've said, with you doing proper oversight. I've had a lot of issues with how this oversight's done. But don't make it up and don't not tell me or the rest of this committee who ordered that. That was nothing more than a smear campaign. And to say it's not is being disingenuous with this committee. The chairman gave you a chance to actually rehabilitate, and you made it worse. Because at the end of the day, those got put out. And by the way, it also, a fuller record got leaked from executive session, got leaked to the Washington Post. And I don't understand, except how we can say this is okay. How do we say this is fine? This is how we have devolved. And the members on the majority now may be members of the minority at some point. And if we're setting the standard for this is where we're going with these kind of investigations, then we're in trouble. We're in deep trouble because this is another thing that the founders, you and others today, Mr. Burke had said earlier, the founders were deeply concerned about a lot of things. One of the biggest things they were concerned about, as opposed to now I'm glad that everybody on the dais is now an originalist, except this, they also were concerned about a partisan impeachment. A partisan impeachment because you don't like his policies. You don't like what he said and you don't like how he said it. I don't like the way Joe Biden said it, but you blew that off as everybody has the backing of the international community. What we have become is a perpetual state of impeachment. And that is the problem that everyone on this dais should have. But don't come here and be a person who is a witness, sworn witness, and not answer the questions. Adam Schiff's doing that fine without you. But don't come here and say, I'm not going to say, because you know good and well, sometime at some conference, at some committee room, in some little room, somebody said, hey, this is interesting because I have Devin Nunez's phone number. That number matches. And we're going to put it in the report, not because we think Devin Nunez is a part of this, but because he had a phone call with somebody that we were investigating. That's a drive-by. And it's beneath you, and it's beneath this Congress. And that is why I have such a problem with this. And then you leaked further information. This is the problem here. And we can be righteous about trying to get this president or not, but when it comes to this, this is why people are getting so just turned off by this whole thing. When we understand that, that is the problem I have, because you could have handled this differently. You and Mr. Schiff. I'm going to blame the chairman because I hold the member, the one with the pen, responsible. So I'm going to assume he ordered this. He was the one that said put their names in here, and he was the one who can't come and defend that. Unfortunately, he sent you, and you had to take it. That's wrong, and this committee deserves better. With that, I yield back.
Gentleman yields back. Gentlelady from California is recognized.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. The gist of the question here is the potential of abuse of the president's power to benefit himself in the next election. Now, America is based on free and fair elections, and after Russia interfered in the 2016 election, the American people are rightfully concerned about ensuring that the next election is free of foreign interference. And keeping that in mind, I'd like to ask you, Mr. Goldman, the following question. Ambassador Sondland testified that according to Rudy Giuliani, quote, President Trump wanted a public statement from President Zelensky committing to investigations of Burisma and the 2016 election. Isn't that correct?
Yes.
And Ambassador Sondland testified, as the screen in front of you shows, that President Zelensky, quote, had to announce the investigations. He didn't actually have to do them.
Correct.
Mr. Goldman, you're an experienced former prosecutor. Is it common to announce an investigation but not actually to conduct the investigation?
No, usually it works the reverse. Normally you don't announce the investigation because you want to develop as much evidence while it's not public, because if it's public, then you run into problems of people matching up testimony and witnesses tailoring their testimony, which is part of the reason why the closed depositions in our investigation were so important.
So what did that evidence, this evidence about the announcement, tell you about why President Trump would only care about President Zelensky announcing the investigations but not actually conducting them?
There were two things that it said. One is whatever he claims, the president claims about his desire to root out corruption, even if you assume that these investigations are for that purpose, as he has stated, it undermines that because he doesn't actually care if the investigations are done. So even if you assume, which I don't think the evidence supports, that it's corruption, then he's still not doing the corruption investigations. And the second is, he just wanted the public announcement. The private confirmation was not enough, and that's an indication that he wanted the political benefit from them.
It looks to me that the announcement of the investigation could benefit the president politically because the announcement alone could be Twitter fodder between now and the next election to smear a political rival. That's consistent with the findings. You know, President Nixon attempted to corrupt elections, and his agents broke into Democratic Party headquarters to get a leg up on the election, and then he tried to cover it up, just as we've seen some obstruction here. But even more concerning in this case, President Trump not only appears to have abused the power of his office to help his own re-election campaign, he used a foreign government to do his bidding, and he used military aid as leverage to get the job done. Now, this aid was approved by Congress. It was appropriated on a bipartisan basis for Ukraine to fight Russia, who'd invaded them. And while this aid was withheld, people died while this aid was being withheld. And some, have argued since ultimately the aid was released that there was not a problem. But Mr. Goldman, isn't it true that the aid was released only after the president got caught and only after Congress learned of the scheme to make this life or death aid conditional on this announcement of investigation of his political rival?
There were several things that made the president realize that this was coming to a head and could not be concealed. The whistleblower complaint was circulating around the White House. The congressional committees announced their own investigation. And then perhaps the Washington Post op-ed on September 5th linking the two. And then the Inspector General notified the committee that there was this whistleblower complaint that was being withheld
Correct.
by the Trump administration.
Correct. Well, I've made it clear throughout this investigation that I didn't want to be part of a third impeachment inquiry, but the direct evidence is very damning. And the president hasn't offered any evidence to the contrary. We've asked, we've subpoenaed, we've invited the president, and nothing has come forward. If he had evidence of his innocence, why wouldn't he bring it forward? You know, this is a very serious matter that strikes at the heart of our Constitution, and it's of concern that we are here, but I've heard over and over again that this is too fast. Well, Ms. Jackson Lee and I were talking. We were both members of this committee during the Clinton impeachment. That took 73 days. We're here on the 76th day. We need to proceed. And I thank you, Mr. Goldman, for your hard work and for your presentation. I yield back, Mr. Chairman.
Thank you.
Without objection, the hearing will stand in recess for 15 minutes.